Every GM car ever made had one inside it. The self-starter that replaced the hand crank that killed men. The radio bolted to the dashboard. The airbag that fired in the fraction of a second between you and the windshield. The engine control module. The small black box that told your car how to breathe, how to fire, how to stay alive on a cold morning in January. None of it came from Detroit. All of it came from a small city in Indiana that most Americans have never heard of. At its peak, Delco Electronics in Kokomo employed 30,000 people. The same engineers who built the navigation system that guided Apollo astronauts to the moon came home every evening to houses on the east side of town. Every day, those factories shipped 28,000 engine control modules, the brain of every GM vehicle on American roads. Then General Motors decided that brains were too expensive. In 1999, GM quietly spun Delco off into a new company called Delphi and walked away. 6 years later, Delphi collapsed. 22,000 retirees, engineers, technicians, the people who had spent their careers wiring the American automobile, lost up to 70% of their pensions. Not because the company failed, because the people who ran it made sure they would never have to pay the bill. How does the company that built the brain of the American automobile end up betrayed by the very industry it created? Chapter 1. The Barn and the Death That Started Everything. In the winter of 1910, a man named Byron Carter made a small mistake. He forgot to retard the spark on his Cadillac before cranking the engine by hand. The crank kicked back. It broke his jaw. The infection that followed killed him. Byron Carter was a friend of Henry Leland, the founder of Cadillac. Leland watched his friend die from a piece of metal attached to a car. He made a decision. No one else would die starting an automobile. He called every engineer he knew. All of them said the same thing. An electric starter small enough to fit inside a car was impossible. Henry Leland had not built Cadillac by accepting impossible. He called a young engineer in Dayton, Ohio. His name was Charles Kettering. Kettering was 34 years old and had already changed the world once. Working at National Cash Register, he had built the first electric motor for a cash register, a machine that ran on short, intense bursts of electricity. When his colleague Edward Deeds asked for help fixing a car he was building from a kit, Kettering applied the same principle. Not sustained power, a short, violent surge, enough to turn the engine over, enough to start the fire inside. They worked in a barn behind Deeds' house in Dayton. No investors, no corporate backing. 2 men, a workbench, and a problem that had already killed someone. In 1909, when Cadillac ordered 5,000 ignition sets, Kettering and Deeds made it official. They named their company after the barn, after the city, after the work itself. The Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, Delco. By February 1911, Kettering had a working prototype. The electric self-starter performed 3 functions that every car still uses today. It started the engine, it produced the spark for ignition, and it supplied current for the lights. 1 small motor, 3 problems solved. Henry Leland ordered 12,000 units for his 1912 Cadillac models. The hand crank disappeared almost overnight. With it went the broken wrists, the shattered jaws, the men who died in their own driveways. A man's death had built an industry. By 1918, General Motors was watching. GM's founder, William Durant, had spent years assembling the most powerful collection of automotive suppliers in the country under a holding company called United Motors. Delco was the crown jewel. That year, GM acquired United Motors, and with it, Delco, for $45 million. Kettering took his money and went to work for GM directly, becoming vice president of research. He would hold that position for 27 years. In that time, he would hold 186 patents. He would help invent Freon, leaded gasoline, and the lightweight diesel engine that made the modern locomotive possible. But the company he built, the one that started in a barn with a problem that had killed a man, was now the property of General Motors. It was a trade that would define both of them for the next 100 years. What neither man could have known, standing in that barn in 1909, was that the company they built to save lives would one day be discarded to save a balance sheet. That ending was still a long way off. First, there was a city to build. Derininan, Kananaminoan, Unachinuan. Chapter 2, Kokomo, the city Delco built. Kokomo, Indiana sits 60 miles north of Indianapolis, on a flat stretch of land where the cornfields end and the factory floors begin. In the early 20th century, it was a modest Midwestern city, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, went to the same churches their parents went to, and expected to spend their lives within 20 miles of where they were born. Delco changed all of that. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the Kokomo plants grew quietly alongside GM's expanding empire. Then in 1936, Delco did something that would redefine both the company and the city. They built the first dashboard-installed car radio in America, a device that transformed the automobile from a machine of transportation into a machine of experience. Families gathered in cars to listen to baseball. Soldiers shipped overseas carried the memory of a radio voice on a long drive home. The American road trip became inseparable from the sound coming out of a Delco speaker. Kokomo built every one of them. The orders came in waves. During World War II, the factories pivoted without missing a shift. The same production lines that built radios for Chevrolets were reconfigured to build communication equipment for the military. Tank radios, aircraft receivers, two-way field sets small enough to fit in a Jeep. The same hands that assembled civilian car radios were now building the devices that coordinated Allied ground operations across Europe and the Pacific. When the war ended, the men came home and the orders kept growing. 1952, the 10 millionth car radio rolled off the Kokomo line. 1961, the 30th million. 1968, the 50th million. Each number was a milestone. Each milestone was a shift added, a building expanded, a family in Kokomo that bought a house instead of renting one. By the late 1960s, Delco employed tens of thousands in Kokomo. The plants ran 3 shifts. The lights never went off. On U.S. Highway 31, the buildings stretched for miles. Plant 2, Plant 5, Plant 6, Plant 8, Plant 9, Plant 10. A city within a city. The workers at Delco earned wages that set the standard for Howard County. Men who had never expected to own a home owned one. Women who had worked their whole lives in low-wage retail jobs found steady union work on the Delco floor. Families sent children to college, the first in their family name to go. The children of Delco workers became teachers, engineers, doctors. Kokomo called itself the City of Firsts, the self-starter, the first car radio, the first pneumatic rubber tire, the first stainless steel. The city had always had an identity built on invention, but Delco was the engine underneath it. Delco was what made the identity pay the mortgage. By 1970, something remarkable happened. GM merged Delco Radio with the AC Electronics division based in Milwaukee, a division that had been doing something far beyond car radios. AC Electronics had been building guidance and navigation systems for the Apollo space program. Those engineers and that work came to Kokomo. The city that built the family road trip was about to help build the path to the moon. Chapter 3, From Cars to the Moon. On Christmas Eve 1968, 20 million Americans sat in front of their televisions and waited. Apollo 8 had disappeared behind the far side of the moon 45 minutes earlier. No signal, no contact. Nothing but silence from a spacecraft carrying 3 human beings 240,000 miles from Earth. Mission Control could do nothing but wait. The country could do nothing but watch. On the NBC broadcast that night, one man stood in front of the cameras and explained, in calm and precise language, exactly what was happening. His name was Donald Atwood. He was the general manager of Delco Electronics in Kokomo, Indiana, because the navigation system guiding Apollo 8 around the moon had been designed and built by his division. When the signal came back and the astronauts were safe, Atwood exhaled along with the rest of America. Kokomo had helped get them there. The connection between Delco and NASA had begun years earlier. In the early 1960s, GM created a research laboratory in California focused on defense and aerospace systems. That organization was eventually folded into Delco, and the combined division took on one of the most complex engineering challenges in human history: building a guidance computer small enough, reliable enough, and precise enough to navigate a spacecraft to the moon and back. It worked. When AC Electronics merged with Delco Radio in 1970 and relocated to Kokomo, the city quietly became one of the most sophisticated electronics manufacturing centers in the United States. The same zip code that shipped car radios to Chevrolet dealerships was now home to engineers who had solved problems that no one had solved before. Donald Atwood saw what Kokomo could become. He was not a man who thought small. In 1974, Atwood became general manager of Delco Electronics with a single conviction: microprocessors were about to transform the automobile, and Delco would be the company that made it happen. Every GM division believed it deserved to control its own electronics. Atwood fought them all. He walked into boardrooms and made the argument that a centralized, specialized electronics division, based in Kokomo, was the only way GM could compete. He won. Delco got the contract for GM's engine control business. The engineers in Kokomo went to work. By 1975, the division had established a solid-state design center. Kokomo was now designing its own semiconductor components. By 1982, they built a 65,000-square-foot clean room to manufacture silicon wafers. A city in Indiana was growing its own computer chips. The results were extraordinary. In 1986, Delco introduced the passkey anti-theft system on the Corvette, the first of its kind on an American production car. In 1988, they introduced the head-up display, projecting speed and navigation data directly onto the windshield. By 1989, the Kokomo plants were producing 28,000 engine control modules every single day. The small black box that managed fuel injection, ignition timing, and emissions on every GM vehicle in America. Built here by these hands in this city. Atwood had been right. Kokomo was the heart and soul of the electronics revolution for General Motors, which made what came next not just a business decision. Chapter 4, The Crack in the Foundation, Part 1. The first sign that something was wrong did not come with a layoff notice or a plant closure. It came with a merger. In 1985, General Motors purchased Hughes Aircraft Company for $5.2 billion. At the time, the largest corporate acquisition in American history. GM folded Hughes together with Delco Electronics to form a new subsidiary called Hughes Electronics Corporation. On paper, it looked like an expansion. Delco was growing, Delco was being rewarded, but inside the organization, something had shifted. Delco was no longer Delco. It was a piece of something larger, something that answered to different priorities, different executives, different quarterly targets. The division that had spent decades earning its autonomy, fighting for its contracts, building its clean rooms, winning its arguments in GM boardrooms, was now one asset inside a portfolio that also included defense contracts, satellite systems, and aerospace programs worth billions. In that portfolio, a factory in Kokomo making car radios and engine modules was not the most glamorous line item. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the pressure came from a direction that no one in Kokomo could fully control. The world was getting cheaper. Electronics manufacturing in Taiwan and South Korea had scaled rapidly. Factories in Asia were producing the same components: radios, circuit boards, control modules, at a fraction of the cost. The math was not complicated. A Delco worker in Kokomo earned UAW and IBEW wages, with full benefits, pension contributions, and health care. A worker in a Taiwanese chip factory earned a fraction of that. No pension, no health care guarantee, no decades of accumulated obligations. For a company in the business of building cars, the question was becoming unavoidable. Why are we making our own chips? It was a reasonable question. It was also a dangerous one, because the answer, the logical, financial, spreadsheet-approved answer, pointed toward a conclusion that would hollow out an entire city. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to read them. In 1990, 1, Plant 5 on North Washington Street closed. The facility that had assembled and tested circuit boards since 1953 went dark. The building was demolished 2 years later. The land sat vacant. One plant, 10.5 acres. It seemed manageable. But Plant 5 was not a standalone decision. It was a signal. The first indication that GM's leadership was beginning to ask a question that had no good answer for Kokomo. The question was not, how do we make Delco more competitive? The question was, do we need Delco at all? Inside GM's executive floors, the language was shifting. Words like core competency and non-core assets were appearing in strategy documents. The argument being built, quietly and carefully, was that General Motors was an automobile company. It designed cars. It assembled cars. It sold cars. Everything else, the parts, the components, the electronics, could theoretically be purchased from someone else. Someone cheaper, someone who did not have 30 years of pension obligations attached to every worker on the floor. Part 2. In 1997, the decision became official. Delco Electronics was transferred out of Hughes Electronics and placed inside a new GM division called Delphi Automotive Systems. The move was framed as a reorganization, a streamlining of GM's parts and components businesses under one roof. The engineers in Kokomo were told the transition would bring focus, stability, a clearer mission. What it actually brought was distance. Delco was no longer a GM division with a direct line to the executive suite. It was now a subdivision of a subdivision, one piece of a sprawling parts conglomerate that supplied not just GM but competitors across the industry. The identity that had been built over 8 decades, the name on the building, the culture of the clean room, the pride of the engineers who had navigated spacecraft and designed the brains of American automobiles. All of it was being absorbed into something larger and more anonymous. The workers felt it. The engineers felt it. The managers who had spent their careers at Delco felt it most of all. Something was ending. They could not yet say what, but the feeling was there, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. What the workers in Kokomo did not know, could not know because it was never said plainly, was that the transfer to Delphi was not the destination. It was the preparation. GM's leadership had been studying the numbers for years. The pension obligations, the healthcare costs, the labor agreements negotiated over decades. They added up to a liability that sat on GM's balance sheet like a stone. Tens of billions of dollars owed to people who had already done their work, already given their years, already earned what they were promised. The solution being discussed in boardrooms was elegant in its simplicity. Spin the parts business off entirely. Create a separate public company. Transfer the workers, transfer the obligations, walk away clean. The workers would still have jobs. The retirees would still have pensions, technically. The obligations would still exist, technically. They would just no longer be GM's problem. It would take 2 more years to execute, but by 1997, the architecture of the plan was already in place. The people of Kokomo were already living inside a decision that had been made above them, without them, and entirely at their expense. They just didn't know it yet. The announcement was coming, and it would be delivered not with anger, not with apology, but with a press release. Chapter 5, The Spinoff, The Quiet Betrayal. On May 28, 1999, General Motors spun off Delphi Automotive Systems as a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. The press release was 4 paragraphs long. GM's chairman John Smith called it a strategic move that would allow both companies to focus on their core strengths. Delphi, he said, would have the freedom to compete globally, to pursue customers beyond GM, to grow into a world-class independent supplier. It was the language of opportunity, the language of expansion, the language of men who had already decided what would happen and needed words to make it sound like good news. In Kokomo, the morning of May 28th looked like every other morning. Workers arrived for the early shift. The parking lots filled. The machines started. Inside the plants, the engine control modules moved down the line, 28,000 of them, same as every other day. The name on the building had already changed from Delco to Delphi Delco Electronics Systems. Most workers had barely noticed. A name was a name. What had changed was everything underneath the name. To understand what GM actually did in 1999, you have to understand what GM was carrying. By the late 1990s, General Motors was one of the largest employers in the United States. Decades of union agreements had built a system of wages, benefits, and retirement obligations that was among the most generous in American manufacturing. Workers who had given 30 years to GM expected, and had been promised, that GM would take care of them when those years were done. Healthcare, pension, the basic security that made a working life worth the sacrifice. Those promises had accumulated into a liability that weighed on GM's finances every single quarter. Analysts called it the legacy cost problem, billions of dollars owed not to future workers, but to people who had already retired, already punched out for the last time, already gone home. The parts division, Delphi, carried a disproportionate share of those legacy costs. Its workforce was older, its pension obligations deeper, its healthcare commitments larger than almost any other division of GM. Every quarter, those numbers appeared on GM's consolidated balance sheet. Every quarter, they made GM look more fragile than its executives wanted it to look. The spin-off solved that problem in a single transaction. The moment Delphi became an independent company, its liabilities left GM's books. The pensions, the healthcare obligations, the accumulated promises of 30 years transferred, not eliminated, transferred to a new company, a company that had no history, no reserves, and no guarantee of survival. The agreement contained one provision that would become the hinge of everything that followed. For hourly workers, the UAW members on the factory floor, GM made a commitment. If Delphi ever entered bankruptcy, GM would step in and protect their pension obligations. The union had negotiated hard for that guarantee. They had leverage. They had history. They had the kind of institutional muscle that comes from decades of contract battles. The salaried workers had no such agreement. The engineers, the technicians, the quality managers, the people who had designed the Apollo guidance system, who had built the clean rooms, who had spent careers doing the work that no union contract covered because their jobs required degrees and initiative, and the kind of problem solving that does not fit neatly into a collective bargaining agreement. They were transferred to Delphi with a promise that was not a promise, an expectation that was not guaranteed, in a future that depended entirely on a company that had just been handed a balance sheet full of obligations and told to compete against its suppliers in Taiwan and South Korea. No one said this plainly. No one stood in front of the workers in Kokomo and explained the architecture of what had just happened. There was no town hall meeting where an executive said, "Hourly workers, you have protection. Salaried workers, you do not." It was simply done, quietly, in the language of finance, where the consequences land on people who never learned to read it. David Saddam had worked at Delco for 32 years. He had started on the floor when the plants were still called Delco Radio, when the buildings on Highway 31 ran 3 shifts and the parking lots were full before dawn. He had watched the division grow from car radios into engine computers. He had watched the name change from Delco to Delphi without much concern. Names changed. The work continued. The pension was still there. The healthcare was still there. 32 years of mornings was still worth something. In the fall of 1999, a few months after the spinoff, Saddam sat down with a coworker at lunch and tried to explain the feeling he could not quite name. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to the moment before fear. The stillness that comes when you realize the ground beneath you is not as solid as you believed. He could not have known sitting in that cafeteria that the ground had already shifted, that the decision had already been made, that the people who made it had moved on to other meetings, other quarters, other balance sheets. He just knew that something felt different. In Kokomo, the years between 1999 and 2005 were years of erosion. Delphi struggled from the beginning. The logic of the spinoff, that independence would make the company leaner, more competitive, more agile, collided almost immediately with reality. Delphi's largest customer was still GM. GM was losing market share. As GM sold fewer cars, Delphi built fewer parts. The revenue that was supposed to justify the spin-off never materialized at the scale the architects of the deal had projected. The factories kept running. The workers kept coming in. But the orders were thinner. The overtime disappeared. The newer workers, the ones hired after the spin-off, came in at lower wage tiers. The culture of the place, the one that had been built over 80 years of Delco, began to fray at the edges. Management changed, then changed again. Each new leadership team arrived with a new restructuring plan, a new set of targets, a new language for why this time would be different. It was never different. By 2004, Delphi had lost $4.8 billion. The company that GM had spun off as a symbol of strategic clarity was drowning in the obligations it had been handed and the revenues it could not generate. The bankruptcy filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. What surprised people, what stunned the workers in Kokomo who had given their careers to this place, was what happened inside the bankruptcy. Who was protected, who was not, and who in the middle of all of it still found a way to get paid. Chapter 6. Delphi burns. The bankruptcy. October 8, 2005, a Saturday morning. Delphi Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court in New York. The filing listed $22 billion in assets and $28 billion in liabilities. It was, at that moment, one of the largest industrial bankruptcies in American history. The press release went out before the markets opened. By the time the workers in Kokomo read the news, the lawyers were already in the courtroom. The company's chairman and chief executive was a man named Robert S. Miller. He had been hired just 3 months earlier, specifically for this moment. A veteran restructuring specialist brought in to do what restructuring specialists do. Miller was not a car man. He was not an electronics man. He was a man who understood how to use bankruptcy law as a tool, and he had come to Delphi to use it. Within days of the filing, the shape of Miller's plan became clear. Delphi's 34,000 hourly workers, the UAW members on the factory floors, earned an average of $27 an hour. When benefits were added, the total cost per worker approached $76 an hour. Miller wanted to cut that to $10 to $12 an hour in base wages. More than 50%. He wanted to eliminate tens of thousands of jobs. He wanted to void the union contracts entirely, using the bankruptcy court to do what no negotiation could. The announcement landed in Kokomo like a physical blow. On Monday morning, October 10th, workers arrived at the Delphi plants on Highway 31 and found management handing out leaflets in the parking lot. The leaflets explained the bankruptcy process in careful, neutral language. They used words like reorganization and restructuring and path forward. They did not use the word devastation. They did not use the word betrayal. The workers read the leaflets and went inside. The machine started. The engine control modules moved down the line. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. David Saddam, the 32-year retiree who had felt the ground shift in 1999, spoke to a reporter that week. His voice was quiet, measured, the voice of a man trying to hold something together. "The biggest concern I have now," he said, "is as a retiree after giving 32 years of good work for this company. Do I have health benefits? Am I going to have life insurance? Am I even going to have a pension?" He paused. "This is scary," he said. What made the bankruptcy filing not just devastating but obscene was a detail that emerged within weeks of the Chapter 11 announcement. While Delphi was asking a federal bankruptcy court for permission to cut worker wages by more than half, while it was threatening to void the contracts that had governed the lives of tens of thousands of families, the company had quietly sought court approval for something else entirely: executive bonuses. Delphi wanted to pay 560 of its top executives nearly $40 million in bonuses and incentive payments. The justification was retention. The company needed to keep its leadership team in place during the restructuring. The same leadership team that had presided over $4.8 billion in losses in 2004. the same leadership team that had spent 6 years running the company into the ground. The workers who had built the Apollo guidance system would lose half their wages. The men who had lost billions would receive millions. It was legal. The bankruptcy court had the authority to approve it. That was the most unsettling part. Not that someone had done something criminal, but that the system had been designed to allow it. Edith Buckley had made a decision she believed in. In the fall of 2007, Delphi was offering $25,000 relocation bonuses to workers at its Milwaukee plant, which was closing, if they transferred to Kokomo. The UAW had told members that Kokomo was secure, 4 years of guaranteed production, a future. Buckley was 52 years old, a single mother with a kidney condition that required consistent healthcare coverage. She needed stability more than almost anything else. She rented a truck, packed her house, and drove to Indiana. She was laid off within weeks of arriving. 54 workers were let go alongside her. Many of them, like Buckley, had uprooted their lives based on the same promise. She stood in the parking lot of the Kokomo plant and said what she was thinking out loud to anyone who would listen. "What happened to the ethics of companies?" she said. "I took the job because I didn't have health insurance. Now I don't know if I can find work again at my age and get insurance." No one from Delphi answered her question. No one from GM answered it either. The $25,000 relocation bonus had already been paid. The obligation from the company's perspective had been met. Inside the bankruptcy proceedings, the fight over wages turned into something larger than a labor dispute. Miller pushed hard to void the union contracts. The UAW pushed back. The standoff threatened to trigger a strike that would cascade through GM's entire supply chain, shutting down assembly plants from Michigan to Texas. GM's own finances were already fragile. A Delphi strike could accelerate GM's own collapse. What followed was a negotiation conducted under maximum pressure, with workers' livelihoods as the primary leverage. The eventual settlement cut wages significantly, from $28.75 an hour to as low as $14 for many workers. Healthcare benefits were reduced. The Jobs Bank, a program that paid laid-off workers while they waited for reassignment, was eliminated. The deal set a template that would be used in subsequent negotiations at GM, Ford, and Chrysler. What happened to Delphi workers in Kokomo did not stay in Kokomo. It spread across the entire American auto industry. Since the spin-off in 1999, Delphi employment had fallen from 4,600 workers to fewer than 17,000. Most of those remaining jobs were now slated for elimination under the terms of the restructuring. A company that had once been Indiana's third-largest industrial employer was being systematically dismantled. Through it all, the plants kept running. Fewer workers, lower wages, diminished benefits. But the machines did not stop. The engine control modules still moved down the line. GM still needed them. The cars still needed their brains, even as the people who built those brains were being told their decades of work were worth less than they had been promised. There is a particular cruelty in being asked to keep doing the work while the terms of the work are being rewritten around you. The workers in Kokomo understood this. They showed up anyway, because the alternative, no work, no wages, no health insurance, was worse. That calculation, the one that traps people in places that have already decided to discard them, is not unique to Kokomo. It is the oldest calculation in American industrial history. But knowing that does not make it easier to live inside it. The bankruptcy was not the end. It was the preparation for something worse. A second betrayal, delivered not by Delphi, but by the company that had created Delphi in the first place. GM was coming back. And when it did, it would finish what the spinoff had started. Chapter 7. The Pension Massacre. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. Larger than Delphi, larger than Enron, larger than anything the country had seen before. The federal government stepped in with a rescue package. The Obama administration assembled a task force. Billions of taxpayer dollars were committed to keeping GM alive. In the negotiations that followed, decisions were made quickly and under enormous pressure. Who would be protected? Who would be sacrificed? which obligations GM would honor and which it would walk away from. The task force was trying to save an industry. In that framing, the workers of Kokomo were a line item. The decision that would define the rest of their lives was announced without ceremony. GM would not assume the pension obligations for Delphi's salaried workers. The hourly workers, the UAW members, had their agreement. GM honored it. Their pensions were transferred to GM's own pension plan and protected. The union had negotiated that guarantee a decade earlier, and the guarantee held. The salaried workers had no such agreement. The engineers, the technicians, the quality managers, the people who had spent careers doing the work that kept the clean rooms running and the Apollo computers functioning. They had transferred to Delphi in 1999 with an expectation, reasonable, earned, human, that their decades of service would be honored. That expectation was not a contract, and in bankruptcy court, expectations without contracts are worth nothing. On July 31, 2009, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that insures private pension plans, formally terminated the Delphi salaried pension plan and assumed responsibility for it. What that meant in practical terms was a cut. The PBGC operates under statutory limits. It cannot pay an individual more than a maximum monthly benefit set by federal law. For many Delphi salaried retirees, their earned pension exceeded that maximum. The difference, the gap between what they had been promised and what the PBGC could legally pay, simply disappeared. Some retirees lost 30% of their monthly income overnight. Others lost 50%. The worst cases lost 70% of what they had spent 30 years earning. 22,000 people. Across Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and a dozen other states. Engineers who had built navigation systems for spacecraft. Technicians who had run the clean rooms where silicon wafers were grown and sliced into chips. Middle managers who had given the best decades of their working lives to a company that no longer existed in service of a parent company that had decided their promises were too expensive to keep. Dave Muffley had worked at Delphi Kokomo for nearly 30 years as a salaried maintenance technician. He had planned carefully. He had taken a buyout from Delphi at 55, accepted a reduced early payment to avoid a potential layoff, and taken a series of other jobs to bridge the gap until he could retire at 62 with his full pension intact. The math had worked on paper. The future had seemed manageable. Then two things happened at almost the same time. His pension was cut by 70%, and his wife was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She died within 3 years. Muffley sat with a reporter from the Associated Press in the summer of 2022, 13 years after the pension cut, and tried to describe what the compounding of those two losses had done to his life. Things fell apart, he said, and things fell apart in a big way. He estimated he had lost at least $130,000 in savings because of the pension reductions over the years. The number was precise because he had been counting. When you lose something that was supposed to be permanent, you count. What do you do when 30 years of work no longer counts for what you were told it would count for? What do you do when the system that was supposed to protect you decides, in a single filing, that your category of worker is the wrong category? Muffley did not have a clean answer. Most of the 22,000 did not. The numbers, broken down by state, told a story that no press release ever would. 4,044 workers in Indiana, 5,181 in Ohio, 5,859 in Michigan, thousands more scattered across New York, Mississippi, Alabama, and a dozen other states where Delphi had operated plants. Each number represented a person who had made decisions about houses, about retirement timelines, about how much to save and how much to spend, based on a promise that had been quietly voided in a federal courthouse in New York. The injustice that burned deepest was not the cut itself. It was the asymmetry. Hourly workers, the UAW members, had their pensions protected by GM. The union had fought for that guarantee in 1999 and it held. Salaried workers, the engineers and technicians who had no union to negotiate on their behalf, received nothing comparable. They had trusted the institution itself. They had believed that 30 years of service, of showing up, of solving problems that no one else could solve, would be honored by the company they had served. That belief had no legal standing. In 2011, a group of Delphi salaried retirees formed an organization and filed suit. They argued that GM had discriminated against them, that the decision to protect union pensions while abandoning salaried pensions was not a neutral financial calculation, but a political one, driven by the Obama administration's desire to preserve union support during a presidential election cycle. The federal district court rejected their claim. The appellate court rejected their claim. In January 2022, the Supreme Court of the United States declined to hear the case. The final door closed without a sound. In October 2020, President Trump signed a memo directing 3 federal agencies to review pension plans held in PBGC trusteeship, specifically citing the Delphi salaried retirees. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, the kind that arrives too late and changes nothing. The agencies reviewed. The benefits did not change. In Congress, the bill to restore the pensions attracted bipartisan support over multiple sessions. It was introduced. It was discussed. It never passed. The retirees kept showing up to hearings. They kept writing letters. They kept counting the money they were no longer receiving. Dave Muffley kept talking to reporters because talking was the only tool he had left. A congressman who supported the bill put it plainly during a subcommittee hearing. These were the people who could not protect themselves. A banker could hedge. A shareholder could sell. A creditor could build protections into a loan agreement. But a worker who had given 30 years to a company, who had no mechanism to extract their pension early, no financial instrument to protect against their employer's collapse, had no defense. They had only the promise, and the promise was gone. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from sudden loss, but from the slow recognition that the institution you believed in did not believe in you. It does not arrive all at once. It accumulates in the monthly pension statement that is smaller than it should be, in the healthcare decision you cannot afford to make, in the conversation with your children about why retirement looks different than you told them it would. The workers of Kokomo had built the brain of the American automobile. They had guided spacecraft around the moon. They had grown silicon wafers in clean rooms and shipped 28,000 engine modules a day and shown up year after year because that was what you did when a place gave you a life worth living. General Motors had taken that life and calculated its value in a bankruptcy proceeding. The calculation did not favor the workers. It never does. Chapter 8. The Chip Irony, GM's Most Expensive Mistake. In 2017, General Motors made a quiet decision that almost no one noticed at the time. The company shut down the last semiconductor manufacturing operation at its Kokomo facility. The clean room that Delco engineers had built in 1982, the one that had grown silicon wafers and printed integrated circuits, and assembled the chips that went into every GM vehicle on American roads. The decision was framed in the language that had become familiar over 3 decades of similar decisions. Semiconductor manufacturing was not GM's core business. Taiwanese suppliers could produce chips faster, cheaper, and with more advanced technology than anything Kokomo could match. The capital investment required to modernize the clean room was prohibitive. The math did not work. The clean room went dark. The equipment was removed. The workers who remained were reassigned or let go. 4 years later, the consequences of that decision became impossible to ignore. The global semiconductor shortage of 2021 did not arrive without warning. The signals had been building for years. Pandemic-driven demand for consumer electronics, concentrated manufacturing in a handful of Asian facilities, supply chains stretched to their absolute limits. When the shortage hit the automotive industry, it hit with a force that no one in Detroit had prepared for. GM was among the hardest affected. Assembly plants across North America were idled for weeks, then months. Trucks and SUVs sat on lots, fully built, except for the chips that controlled their engine management, their safety systems, their infotainment displays. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles could not be completed and could not be sold. The financial cost ran into billions of dollars of lost revenue in a single year. The chips that GM needed, precisely the kind of chips that Kokomo had been producing until 2017, were now controlled entirely by suppliers in Taiwan and South Korea. Suppliers that GM had chosen over its own facility. Suppliers that were now rationing their output across every automaker on Earth simultaneously. GM had eliminated its own supply. Then it needed that supply desperately. Then it had nowhere to turn. The irony was not lost on the people who had worked in that clean room. Former Delco engineers and technicians watched the news coverage of the chip shortage with a recognition that was equal parts vindication and bitterness. They had built that facility. They had argued for its expansion. They had understood from the inside what it meant for an automaker to control its own critical components, to not be dependent on suppliers 10,000 miles away who answered to different customers, different governments, different priorities. The argument had been made and rejected. The math had won. The clean room had closed. One former GM insider, writing about the shortage, was direct. In what had to be viewed as extremely short-sighted strategic planning, GM ended chip production in 2017, just prior to the beginning of the chip shortage. It was, he argued, one of the most detrimental examples of GM's short-sighted failures. A decision made under Mary Barra's watch that echoed every bad decision the company had made in the decades leading to its 2009 bankruptcy. In 2020, a different crisis arrived. The COVID-19 pandemic created a catastrophic shortage of medical ventilators. GM, looking for ways to contribute to the emergency response, announced a partnership with Ventec Life Systems to manufacture ventilators at scale. The facility they chose for production was in Kokomo, Indiana, the same buildings where Delco had once built engine control modules and grown silicon wafers. The hands that had built the brain of the American automobile were now building machines to keep people breathing. It was not the future anyone in Kokomo had imagined, but it was the one they had been given. A city repurposed, a workforce redirected, a legacy compressed into whatever the moment required. The clean room was gone, the chip line was gone, the 30,000 jobs were gone, but the buildings were still there. And the people, the ones who remained, still knew how to build things that mattered. That had always been Kokomo's gift. GM had simply stopped valuing it. Chapter 9. Kokomo Today and What We Lost. Drive down U.S. Highway 31 through Kokomo today, and you will see what remains. Some of the buildings are still there. Large, low structures of brick and corrugated metal that sit back from the road behind chain-link fences and empty parking lots. A few are occupied by GM Components Holdings, the subsidiary that took back a handful of Delphi's Kokomo facilities after the 2009 bankruptcy. Inside those buildings, some manufacturing still happens. Components are still made. A fraction of what once existed still functions. But the scale is gone. The 30,000 jobs are gone. The 3 shifts are gone. The parking lots that filled before dawn and emptied after midnight are gone. What remains is a remnant, a partial preservation of something that was once total. The way a demolished building leaves a foundation that tells you how large the structure used to be. Kokomo has not collapsed. The city has survived, partly because Stellantis, the company that emerged from the Chrysler bankruptcy, still operates transmission plants in Howard County. The economy has diversified slowly and painfully into healthcare, logistics, and light manufacturing. City leaders have worked hard to attract new investment, and some of it has arrived. But Kokomo is not what it was, and the people who remember what it was carry that knowledge the way you carry a scar. Not always visible, but always present. Dave Muffley was still talking to reporters in 2022. 13 years after the pension cut, he had not stopped fighting. Not because he believed the fight would succeed, the Supreme Court had ended that possibility in January of that year, but because stopping felt like agreeing that what had happened to him and 22,000 others was acceptable, that the asymmetry was justified, that the engineers and technicians who had built the brain of the American automobile were worth less than the balance sheet said they were. He was not willing to agree to that. Neither were the others who had spent years in federal courtrooms and congressional hearing rooms, making arguments that were heard, acknowledged, praised for their moral clarity, and then left unaddressed. The bipartisan pension bill that would have restored their benefits was introduced in multiple sessions of Congress. It gathered co-sponsors, it generated press coverage, it never came to a vote. The system that had failed them in 1999 and again in 2005 and again in 2009 continued to fail them in the years that followed, consistently, completely, without apparent embarrassment. What Delco Electronics was, at its best, was something that American industry rarely produces and almost never appreciates until it is gone. It was a place where serious people solved serious problems, where the same engineers who built radios for family vacations built navigation systems for spacecraft, where a city of 50,000 people in the middle of Indiana became, for several decades, one of the most technologically sophisticated manufacturing centers on Earth, where workers earned wages that built lives, not just jobs but actual lives, with houses and educations and the kind of stability that allows a person to raise children without fear. That kind of place does not appear by accident. It is built over decades through investment and commitment and the accumulation of knowledge that cannot be replicated quickly or cheaply. When Charles Kettering and Edward Deeds worked in that barn in Dayton in 1908, they were beginning something that would take a century to fully understand. When GM signed the spin-off papers in 1999, they were ending it in an afternoon. The pension obligations that seemed so burdensome on GM's balance sheet, the legacy costs that made the spin-off feel necessary, were not abstract liabilities. They were promises made to specific people in specific cities in exchange for specific decades of work. The financial engineering that transformed those promises into someone else's problem did not eliminate them. It simply moved the cost from a corporation's quarterly report onto the lives of 22,000 individuals who had no mechanism to absorb it. Because General Motors is still here. The company that filed for bankruptcy in 2009 emerged restructured, recapitalized, and returned to profitability within 2 years. Today, it is one of the largest automakers in the world, developing electric vehicles, autonomous driving systems, and the next generation of automotive technology. Its market capitalization runs into the tens of billions of dollars. The workers of Kokomo are still here too. The ones who survived, the ones who rebuilt, the ones who are still counting what they lost. Dave Muffley is still here. The buildings on Highway 31 are still here, quieter than they used to be, doing less than they used to do. And every GM vehicle on American roads today still has a Delco inside it. The engine control module, the sensors, the electrical architecture that tells the car how to breathe, the direct descendants of the technology that Charles Kettering began in a barn, that Donald Atwood expanded into a moon program, that 30,000 workers in Kokomo refined over 8 decades into something extraordinary. There is no Delco name on it, no Kokomo address, no acknowledgement of where it came from or who built it or what it cost to build it, and then discard the people who built it. Just a small black box, doing its work in silence, the way the workers always did, the way the workers always deserved better than.